Thanks so much if you're able to join us. We are gaining participants as I speak, so we're going to wait just a couple minutes and ensure that everybody that's joining on time is able to hear our discussion from the beginning. Thanks again for joining. Well, good day, and thanks everybody for joining. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead our Natural Resources Agency, and I'm joined today by Secretary Karen Ross, our state's Agriculture Secretary, who will co-host our discussion today. Karen, how are you?
I'm doing great. I just got back into the country, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, here's to actually being in person for one of these events.
Soon.
We have held about 24 Secretary Speaker series since the pandemic. And these discussions are all about elevating leaders and big thinkers across our state that are driving on priorities that we share and that Governor Newsom shares. So I too am really excited today to be talking with a broad range of leaders and doers across our state on this topic of natural and working lands. And Karen, I want to start off a question for you. You know, a lot of the work that we do in government can be a bit indecipherable sometimes to folks that don't do this on a daily basis. So how the heck would you describe our work on natural and working lands and what it can mean to climate change to a friend maybe at a dinner party who doesn't follow the day-to-day processes of state government?
Well, first of all, I'd say you're eating food because of how we care for our land. So that's a working landscape, producing food. But that's not the only working landscape that we think about. We also think about our forests and our wetlands and everything that makes up this wonderful environment that we enjoy here in California. What we're really focused on is how do we use and work with these lands to be more resilient to drought and to flood and to higher temperatures, to climate, which we're living with every day. For us at the Department of Food and Agriculture, our focus is on those working lands that are croplands and rangelands. And how do we increase soil carbon, sequester carbon, increase that carbon, which then produces more fertility, more water holding capacity, improve nutrient cycling, and biodiversity. A quarter of the world's biodiversity is in that topsoil, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. And how do we coexist and enhance habitat for our wildlife species and our declining biodiversity? So we have climate smart ag programs at the Department of Food and Agriculture that provide incentives for growers to conserve this farmland and then to implement practices to enhance this opportunity to store carbon and provide all of those multiple benefits. I don't know if that answers the question, but it is about being able to farm today and still be able to produce food for generations to come.
Yeah, it makes great sense to me. And I think about my own career, and I've worked on climate issues over 20 years. And so much of the early part of that time was focused on technology. You know, renewable energy, electrifying vehicles, energy efficiency. And those are, of course, important climate solutions. Yeah. But I think part of what we're talking about here today is that our lands, whether it's, you know, your wetland or your natural area or your farm or your ranch, is really underutilized in the fight against climate change and our efforts to protect people and nature from the impacts of climate change. So today we'll have a chance to talk about people that have been working on this topic for quite a long time.
Right.
Before we dig in, I'm just going to give everybody who's joined us, actually several hundred at this point, an opportunity to understand sort of our structure for discussion and how you can participate as well. First of all, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you have comments or questions that you would like to ask us, please use that Q&A function. Karen and I, as hosts of the discussion, will be integrating questions throughout our discussion today. We'll first hear from Manuel Oliva, who leads Point Blue Conservation Science, to really set the table for the discussion today and to level set for all of us what we're talking about on this topic. Then we have the honor of being joined by Frankie Myers, Vice Chairman of the Yurok Tribe, to educate us about the indigenous approach to this work and what we can learn. And then we're joined by Julie Rentner, the president of River Partners, which is a on-the-ground, get-it-done conservation group working on these multi-benefit solutions. And Nicole Matna Van Vleck, who's the president and CEO of Matna Farms up to the north of us in Sacramento. Maybe the emblem of this multi-benefit farming, growing rice and creating wildlife habitat. And then after we hear from each of them, we're going to essentially join a discussion among ourselves with Amanda Hansen, who leads our climate work at the Natural Resources Agency, and who, along with partners throughout government, is really crafting our strategy on natural and working lands. And then finally, special treat, State Senator Nancy Skinner will join the conversation. Senator Skinner, you probably know, is a major champion of all things climate change and the author of an important bill last year on this topic. So a lot of ground to cover here in the next hour and 15 minutes, Karen. So I'll turn it to you to introduce our first speaker here.
And it's a pleasure for me to do so. Thanks so much, Wade. And I want to compliment you for starting this speaker series. I'm actually kind of jealous that you have created this, and I'm hoping that I have lots of CDFA employees and our stakeholders joining us as well. So thanks for doing that. It's great to be here. And I'm especially excited to introduce our friend, Manuel Manny Oliva from Point Blue Conservation Sciences. Such an important organization, and talk about people who are all about science and gathering the data to help us better understand how we can move forward with nature-based solutions. Manny, we're going to give you this small responsibility of, in 3 to 5 minutes, doing a better job of explaining natural working lands than I just did when I responded to Wade's question, and really how you use this whole cadre, 160 scientists that are all about focusing on our landscapes and our opportunities to really mitigate the impacts of climate and habitat loss, and how we have the healthiest ecosystem services possible. With that, you've got your 3 to 5 minutes to give us the answers, Manny. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Secretary Ross, thank you so much for the introduction. So I thought I would start by defining sort of what we talk when we talk about natural and working lands. What do we mean? And historically, they've been kind of thought about as different landscapes. Sort of natural lands sort of being closer to the natural state, and working lands, maybe thinking about agriculture or working forests. And on this first slide that I wanted to share a little bit of, if we look at California across all of the landscapes, 90% of them are divided into these can be divided into these 8 different land types. And this is the way that California's climate smart strategy on natural working lands is looking at different land types. And each of these land types consists of both natural and working lands. And I highlighted grasslands a little bit as an example of where it can be either wildlife habitat and can be grazing lands, and taking action to improve the soil health, for example, adding composting, regardless of how that land is used, can provide really important climate benefits. So when we think about climate solutions, to be effective, we have to think about it as applied across natural and working lands together. So in my next slide, I wanted to ask sort of the question about what are the climate benefits that we can achieve? And when we talk about climate benefits, we normally think about 2 categories. One is climate mitigation, the ability to reduce emissions from land use, to capture emissions from the atmosphere into the land, and store carbon within the land itself. But just as important, there is climate adaptation, building the resiliency of this land to climate change effects. For example, improving water retention with more severe periods of drought. And when we are working on climate solutions on landscapes, as Secretary Crowfoot mentioned earlier, there's opportunity for multiple benefits. benefits such as biodiversity, cultural, wildfire mitigation. And all of these benefits can be parts of a climate solution. One of the things I wanted to share is this map on the slide, which is a little bit of our research, the type of research that we're doing to unlock the potential of natural working lands to capture carbon emissions. Now, what this map represents is essentially the percent carbon in soil across rangelands, which are mostly grasslands, in this particular case, across San Mateo County. By measuring carbon in the soil of various ranches, we've been able to develop this model that predicts percent carbon in the soil across all rangelands in the entire county of San Mateo. What we can do now with this map is then pinpoint areas. Where can we more effectively sequester carbon? Where do we strategically put our efforts to sequester the most carbon that we possibly can? And what's really exciting about this map is this map can exist for the entire state of California and across all types of land, all the land types that I mentioned earlier. And this is a living model. This model will change over time as we apply more practices. We get to see how is it affecting the amount of soil carbon that we have, and what are the effects of climate change over time to the practices that we're putting into place. So if we go to our last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities to scale action in the climate smart strategy that we will be hearing later about. That's really leading thought around these efforts. There's a list of 7 opportunity areas to scale action. And I wanted to just to touch on a few of these that we as an organization are really thinking about. One is this idea of multiple benefits. Beyond the important climate benefits that we can achieve, how do we measure and consider other important benefits, such as biodiversity and water recharge and cultural significance of these actions that we put into place? The idea of long-term monitoring is something that's very important to us. The idea that when we put an action on the ground, how do we not only measure how it does over time, but how do we keep learning from that action and build future actions that are even more impactful and longer lasting? And then in terms of we like to think about holistic stewardship. So applying climate solutions on different neighboring landscapes so that they build upon each other, so they're additive to each other, and at a landscape level, at a higher level, we're achieving more powerful solutions that last even longer. But the area that I really want to highlight, something that we as an organization are incredibly excited about, is the growth in social science. These really exciting maps that I showed earlier are very powerful ways to target climate solutions. But at the end of the day, people implement these solutions. And the example I have here is of one of our partner biologists who works directly with landowners to combine our science with their knowledge to build climate solutions. To achieve the scale of climate action that we need, we have to increase our ability to work with more communities, especially those that have been historically marginalized. And social science can help us understand their priorities and ensure that equity is included within decision-making and benefit sharing. So I think I'll stop there just with this whole overview, and I'm happy to continue the discussion and partnering as we move forward. Thank you.
Manny, thanks so much. That was an incredibly cogent presentation of really the challenge and the opportunity. And you talk about carbon sequestration, in other words, removing carbon from the atmosphere. And as I understand it, that's become really important for the state because now we're aiming towards a carbon neutrality goal or a net zero goal by the middle of the century. So we were so focused on pollution reduction and meeting our AB 32 goals. And obviously we need to continue to drive out carbon, but an important piece of the puzzle towards getting to carbon neutrality seems like that sequestration. And I just wanted to ask you a simple question. How hard is it to measure carbon in the ground? Is that a perfected science? How far have we come on that?
We've come really far, but it's a continually growing science. And the historic way that we normally have done it is take samples, core samples, and the more samples, the higher edge that we can sort of create a larger area. But now we're using drone technology or satellite technology to create predictive models based on those samples and other kind of measurements. One of the other measurements that we use is ground cover. What kind of ground cover do we see? And then that can indicate to us, well, what kind of potential does this have for carbon sequestration? It is continually growing. It's very exciting. But what's really exciting is that we still don't fully understand the potential for this soil to maintain carbon. And it's not going to be applied everywhere in the same way, but there's real big opportunities in the state to change practices and really take advantage of this. And we would consider the top 40 centimeters of soil to store significant amounts of carbon.
Incredible. Well, Manny, thanks so much for setting us off in the discussion, giving us a really solid foundation for conversation today. You know, one of the most incredible opportunities in my job over the last 3 years have been to meet and learn from tribal leaders across the state about what it means to steward California. Tribal communities have been stewarding California since time immemorial. And one of the most meaningful days I've had in this job is when I had a chance to accompany Governor Newsom and spend time with Yurok tribal leadership on the Klamath River, understanding their vision and their work on maintaining and stewarding their natural and working lands. And I'm so glad that we're able to welcome Frankie Myers into the discussion. I've learned a ton from Frankie and had a lot of fun with him in the process. He serves, as I said, as vice chairman of the Yurok tribe and has spent over 20 years working for his tribe on the topics we'll discuss today. So, Vice Chairman, I just put it to you, what can non-Indigenous Californians learn from tribal governments, tribal communities about this work we have stewarding our natural and working lands? And what approaches are you all taking within the Yurok tribe on these topics?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this. It's been to listen to this point. I think one of what make up the perspective, and as we look at natural and working lands, it's important to understand as Yurok people, as Indigenous people, it's all working lands, right? Pre-contact, our kind of philosophy towards land management and what is nature was that we're part of this world around us, and every part of the environment plays a role, has a job. I think that's critical to thinking about how we use Indigenous knowledge and turn it into policy so we can implement change. I can't stress more this idea of looking at all lands as working lands, and how incredibly important it is to look at fire as a part of the natural landscape, as a part of the forest, just as much as the trees or the prairie, and how that has so many positive benefits, both to carbon sequestration, to building healthy forests, to building resiliency to our watersheds, really looking at a holistic view of our entire landscape. And whether you're looking at healthy benefits to our Roosevelt elk or our agricultural land, there are basic principles that we have learned over millennia, having been in this world and having worked with the forests around us, and really looking at it as three pillars of our landscape. One, the fire management of our landscape, our land management of the trees and the water as well. They're all three connected. And I think in the past few years, we've really seen how incredibly true this is. Our drought, our climate change really emphasizes this connection between our land, our water, and our people, and the importance of making sure that we lift up all three elements of this world, because they're all connected together. Every single one of us is connected to the world around us. And it's extremely important that we look at the worldview in this way. If we're going to move forward, it's one of the things that really drives Yurok to looking at innovative strategies to using our natural lands, our world around us to help combat climate change, whether we're looking at forest carbon sequestration, or we're looking at how we can bring back our prairie lands and use good fire to really lock that carbon sequestration into the soil. These are basic principles that we've learned over thousands of years, and using modern science and scientists. I'm working with others on this call to really bring implementation of that is extremely important. I think it's exciting for me as an Indigenous practitioner to see this kind of unfolding, where my parents, the practices that they did, to manage the land was illegal, and they were, oftentimes jailed for this. And now we're seeing this change and this focus on how can we implement these projects? How can we do it throughout the entire state? How can we look at how this can have a positive impact in teaching what I know to them, but also all of us who live within California, and how we can share these pieces of Indigenous knowledge with the greater community so that we can implement these projects. It's a very exciting time. I love this conversation because we're talking in a way that my grandparents used to talk about being involved in the land, about being a part of the land, about looking at our forests and our streams and our land more than just extractive, right? More than just something to take from, but something that actually helps us live here on this planet, something that is a part of us, is a part of who we are. There's a lot of good overlap in the working lands community and the nature-based kind of ideology of Indigenous people. And I think the basic principles of working with the land, using the land, living along with it, and then really trying to find ways that we can bring our ecosystems back into balance. One of the biggest kind of myths that we fight as Indigenous people is that pre-contact, this continent was wild or natural without humans being here. And I think that's incredibly critical as we have this discussion about working lands and natural lands, because all of this continent, the entirety, 100%, regardless of where you were, was holistically managed, practically managed, whether it was through using our trees, whether it was using fire to manage our forests, our rivers, our salmon, it was there. And I think that the principle and the foundation that guides UROC is one that should be shared throughout California. And it's the idea that nature is not natural without human interaction, right? We are a part of this world. We're part of the world around us. And until humans kind of adopt this idea that we are a part of the nature, human beings are part of this nature, we're part of the system, we're really going to see some amazing things happen. And we're seeing this conversation play out. We're having these conversations at the levels we need to. We've had conversations, both as secretaries, we've had conversations about this. It's extremely exciting. And we hope we can keep moving this idea that humans were meant to be here. We're meant to play a role in the world around us. And it's our responsibility to do so.
Frankie, I'm so inspired listening to you. Every time we have a chance to meet, I get excited all over again because, there's a term nowadays that's very popular. And what you're talking about is like, it's back to the future. And that's about how do we regenerate this earth? The earth will feed us if we pay attention to feeding the earth. And I think that's just what you've been describing to us. And so I'm just so inspired to have these opportunities to work with you as well as with our next two speakers. I'm going to introduce two people at the same time so I can allow ample time for them to talk about partnerships, because Wade, you really called that out in your opening comments. We're not going to do this without partnerships. So first, we have with us Julie Renter from River Partners. Julie, you're all about what's behind you there, that beautiful river that I know you're going to tell us where it is because we're all curious. You've done great work in our state and others of really looking at and restoring our river corridors. to better health and the ecosystems that are involved with that. When we think about climate, we think about drought, and we think about flood. I think you play a critical role for that. Obviously, water is a very precious resource, and I'm anxious to have you talk about the over 13,000 acres that you've been a part of restoring and where the opportunities are for partners. And then I'm going to introduce also with us today my longtime friend, Nicole Matna Van Vlak. Nicole is president of her family's farming operation, Matna Farms. And her background also speaks very eloquently to the work that they've done as rice growers in partnering with organizations like River Partners, really restoring habitat for our visiting bird population every winter. And Nicole, I know that your family has done some really, quote unquote, and I mean this as a pun on purpose, groundbreaking work on wildlife-friendly conservation easements on some of your land, as well as what you and your husband do with the ranching operation on Stan's side of the family. So very anxious to hear both of your thoughts on partnerships and where you see additional opportunities for working land. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Julie, and then we'll turn it over to Nicole. Okay, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the incredible invitation to be here with you all and to share a bit of our stories. I know we're a little bit behind, so I'll keep my remarks kind of short, but what I wanted to share with you all was a little bit about the on-the-ground experiences that we've had here at River Partners for the last 24 years doing the reconnection work. We have the honor of actually connecting water and land for plants, wildlife, and people across vast acreages, mostly in the Central Valley, but along our river corridors. And, you know, some of the interesting things we've learned along the way with a real culture of partnership. It's in the name. It's been here since this organization was founded. Some of the things we've learned is that as much as you may think that natural and ecological restoration and natural lands might be disconnected from people, as long as water is involved, as long as vegetation and soil is involved, people are involved, right? And so through lots of learning and lots of partnership, what we've been able to describe is that when we can reconnect our disconnected river corridors, and we can reconnect them for lots of reasons, right? River Partners kind of problem statement has always been focused on wildlife, but there's lots of reasons to reconnect our river systems. But when we really focus on landscape scale reconnection, not just on the surface of the land from the headwaters down to the sea, but also vertically from our atmosphere all the way down into our aquifers. When we can reconnect our natural systems, we're providing benefits not just for our lost ecological capital here in California, but also for all of the people who live here. And I mean all of the people who live here. So our tangible experiences in river restoration have been in improving flood safety. So when we can give rivers more space, reconnect their floodplains, we can actually reduce water surface elevations of peak flood events and keep people safe, especially in areas that are particularly flood prone. Our climate change modeling is looking like some pretty dire changes to our peak stages in the coming decades. And this is going to be a really important mitigation measure for us. We can do that flood system safety work while improving the ecology of our freshwater systems. But it goes deeper than that as well. We think of floodplain reconnection and restoration as a water conservation triple threat. We can reduce demand on some irrigated lands around the edges of the rivers, while we also provide opportunities for water to soak in and be available to us during dry times. And then we also have the opportunity to possibly, if we can reconnect enough of our floodplains, reoperate some of our dams in a way that will allow us a little bit more storage in the existing structures we have. So I always like to do talks with an ask. That's what I've been told. So my ask to this group is to say, River Partners has been working for 24 years, taking bold action, thinking really big and trying to deliver as much as we possibly can quickly and with great partnerships in science and agriculture, academia, labor, workforce development, the whole nine, public access. I want to ask all of you to bring your bold ideas, right? We have Secretary Crowfoot here. We have Secretary Ross here. We are lined up like none of us have ever seen before to deliver conservation at a scale that's really going to bring this state into a more resilient future. So take bold action. If you have some bold ideas, jump out there and do it. This is the time.
Thanks for that challenge. Nicole.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Secretary Ross. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, for really bringing us all together today, continue these collaborative efforts that we have begun in California. It's really exciting work, as Julie mentioned. I've spent a lot of time on the farm trying to put many of these practices into place at Montana Farms. And it's been a model for us there in working lands, climate smart practices for decades. We put our farm under a conservation easement with the help of the state of California back in the year 2000. And it will be a property that will provide not only agricultural benefits, but conservation benefits in perpetuity. You can see behind me a little bit of what we do, but we have, after our harvest each and every year, we take the opportunity to create this environment that you see. These are white-faced ibis, and this is a practice that we have done for decades. It simply is chopping rice straw, incorporating it back into the soil. We talk about soil-rich opportunities. We put it back in with a big paddle wheel type machine, big steel wheels, incorporate it into the soil, and it creates this wonderful environment. A bug buffet is what it's often referred to because of the amount of zooplankton and other species that are created by, with this decomposition. The birds love it. This winter, you know, we really had to become very creative and a model for what to do during drought resiliency. And I want to thank the state Department of Water Resources. Had some bold and big ideas. They helped step up with the California Riceland Waterbird Foundation to provide some water in a very difficult time. Normally, the 500,000 rice farmers in this state, about half of them do what we do at Montana Farms and provide these surrogate wetlands in the winter for the migrating shorebirds and waterfowl. This year, the opportunities for being able to do that were limited due to the drought. But with the help of the state, the success was about 50,000 acres, including our farm, to be able to provide this winter surrogate wetlands. We think of our solutions a little differently than maybe some other crops do. Our cover crop really are the birds you see here. We have very clay-like soils in rice fields, so doing a traditional cover crop doesn't work well for rice, right? We provide this biodiversity for birds. And I like your comment, Secretary Ross, about back to the future, because now one of the things that we've learned from our work on bird projects and the success we've had with rebuilding the Pacific Flyway is also trying to use that same model for fish and for salmon rearing. We've done two things at Montana Farms we're excited about. The first is raising fish food. So this same zooplankton, bug buffet, zoop soup, there are a number of names for this, for what we're providing, but out about 3 weeks, we can put together this nutrient-rich water source that we release from our rice fields into the rivers. It goes from the rivers to the fish. So instead of bringing fish to the rice fields, we're bringing our fish food through the river systems and to the fish themselves. It's something we've been doing about 6 years, and we're looking with the California Rice Commission to really scale this up, make it an NRCS practice going forward for more people to participate in, and for the benefit of this nutrient-rich water that we can provide, getting it into the rivers, which once they were cut off from the floodplain with levee systems and other things, we've not had the opportunity to provide that same floodplain benefit for the fish. We're also raising salmon in the rice fields. It's early under, with the help of UC Davis. We have some hatchery fish that are raised by them, and those are pilot projects, again, to really show the benefit of these floodplains and how the fish naturally do much better on a floodplain than they do in their start of life than in the river. We couldn't do any of these projects without our partners. Our state and federal government partners are crucial, and our friends at Point Blue, River Partners, TNC Audubon, Ducks Unlimited. The collaborative efforts have been tremendous, and the solution-oriented work that's being done is really necessary, and we've made such great progress. We just have to continue in that pattern.
Well, that is so empowering. And I have to say that, so often we pick up the paper, or more accurately, click on that news story, and it's about conflict, right, on water or on resources across California and the West. And those conflicts are real. But I have to say that the collaboration that agriculture and conservation groups are engaged in the Sacramento River Valley, building habitat while producing food, is incredible and a source of inspiration. Listen, another source of inspiration has just joined us, and she is State Senator Nancy Skinner. Now, you all may know Nancy Skinner for a lot of different issues that she leads in California on. She obviously represents, I think, Senate District number 9, Oakland, Richmond, parts of the near East Bay. She chairs the Senate Budget Committee and works on a number of issues. You may not know that she co-founded possibly the first international organization of climate-driven, climate-forward cities called ICLEI before she was ever an elected official. So she was doing climate before it was cool, I can say. And we were thrilled that she has elevated the potential of these projects, these nature-based solutions to climate change on natural and working lands, and specifically through Senate Bill 27 that she passed and the governor signed last year to create this registry for natural and working lands projects. So Senator Skinner, you are talking to a few hundred people across the state, some of whom wake up and think about this stuff, others that are just getting into it, as well as leaders that we've had and featured who are involved in different aspects, and would love to just hear your thoughts on the art of the possible with our natural and working lands.
Certainly, and Secretary Crowfoot, very pleased to join you and thank you for your leadership in this issue. And yes, you could say on one level, maybe I was an early adopter, but I remember my undergrad work was in environmental science. And back in the early 70s, we were studying, what was then only called global warming, and looking at the different scientists. And it wasn't disputed, it wasn't debated. It just was a matter of how significant, how serious was it, and how fast was it. And but I remember that it wasn't even when it was presented in our classes, there wasn't even a question of like science is questioning this. It's more like we know already that our atmosphere traps heat, and that these certain gases assist it, and that we are increasing these gases in our atmosphere, but we don't know how serious it will be yet. But it's something we're monitoring. It's something we know. And to watch then from that time period, and we're talking, close to more than 40 years ago, to see then this complete refutation of the science, and then a very concerted effort politically and by private sector companies to basically deny this, and to the point where where little action was taken when we had the opportunity to make great action, and now we're in this crisis. But interestingly, even then, even back in those 70s, in my ecology classes, we learned about the capacity of soil to capture carbon. Now, they use different terms, but we learned it more in the same way that we learned about plants and plankton, and that the microorganisms in soil have that same capacity. And so, of course, today, when we look at whether it's our ag lands, our forest lands, our park lands, meadows and grasses and such, we have the capacity to have them play a very significant role in this climate crisis, because they can not only hold more carbon. So in other words, if their man's right, they won't release it, but they will also grab it from the atmosphere. So sequester or capture. And that right now we know that the crisis is such that really to avert the most devastating aspects of it, we have to do two things. We have to reduce emissions and we have to get it out of the atmosphere. So the sequestration. And our working lands have that ability. So we are learning a lot now about how to farm, for example, in a way where we maximize the soil's capacity to grab that carbon. And what that really means is you have to think of it, it's living soil. When soil is dead, it doesn't have the microorganisms. And of course, when soil is dead, it's also much more, it's more subject to erosion. It's more subject to dust storms and such. So live microorganism rich soil produces more healthy food, plants. It also will grab that from carbon. So we want to employ that or deploy all of our techniques in California as possible so that we can maximize that ability. And so what my bill did was direct the agency that Secretary Crowfoot administers and our Air Resources Board to set goals for carbon sequestration from those natural and working lands. And the other thing it did is we've got a lot of private sector companies who are pledging now to go carbon neutral. And one of the ways, and they want to make investments. So if we have a registry of projects that they could invest in that are potentially projects that are sequestering carbon in our working lands, then we can get private sector funding for this work. So that was another aspect of the bill. And those are things that we can do that can give us optimism, because I know that many of us who've been working on this a long time, it's easy to get very pessimistic. But what I'm optimistic about is how much more awareness there is of this crisis. And people aren't just putting their, head in their hands. They're like, hey, let's act. We got to do. And so as a legislator, I'm trying to give our state agencies as many tools as possible so that they can act on our behalf to sequester carbon. And this is not working lands, but this year I'm also carrying a bill that would pilot the ability to sequester carbon and store some carbon from our cement plants in California. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to be successful with that. And that's a bill that I've just introduced this year. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, huge thanks, Senator. I mean, just your ability to articulate all of this and educate us in a really enthusiastic way, I'm sure has Secretary Ross levitating, because she's usually spreading the gospel on healthy soils, right?
Yes, she is. Yes.
So what was your experience in the legislature on this? A lot of folks know what we're trying to do on renewables or, zero emission vehicles. This seems like a little bit more of pioneering.
Yes. Well, a lot of members, I would say this is a new concept for them. So when I've always been one of the big advocates to make sure that we have funding in the budget in our cap and trade program for healthy soils. And there's been some skepticism about that. And I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's because we haven't yet adopted all the protocols that would allow us to measure it. And if you can't count it, if you can't really verify and count, then it is hard to make claims. So it is very, very important that we develop and adopt. There are some standards internationally, but we want to make sure that it would work for California. It's very important that we have that to give people the confidence that if we're going to invest in healthy soils or here's another example. Now there's recent research. So we know that methane from livestock is a significant contributor to the greenhouse gas that's going in the atmosphere. It's a large contributor. And now there's recent research that shows that certain additives to the feed, seaweed, for example, can greatly reduce the methane. And when you think about it, it just improves the cow's digestion because the methane is an incomplete digestion. It's the same as when you have it coming out of a landfill. And when it comes out of a landfill, it's because the decomposition process was what we call anaerobic, didn't have oxygen, so it's producing more byproducts, and you have methane releasing. Same thing, if our guts, if we're gassy, or if the cow is, it's their digestive system is not working optimally. So if there are food additives that we can give that can greatly reduce the methane emissions from livestock, then of course we should be engaged in that. But again, we need to be able to verify and measure so that we can give people confidence. And so that's one of the tasks that you all are going to have. And I'm really looking forward to you achieving it, because then I and other of my colleagues can be more successful in pushing through policies that help us implement it so that we don't have the skepticism.
Well, here, and that is our homework, is to actually show these projects can be successful. So Senator Skinner can go out and help us find more money. I want to ask a question to you, Karen, and to Nicole. And so if we can, James, bring in the so-called Brady Bunch view of all of our panelists here. And as you do that, the question is, for agriculture, is this idea of soil health like becoming a mainstream concept? Is it really sort of a niche concept? When you talk about our soil health programs, is there more demand than supply for funding? How do you describe what's happening in agriculture on this?
Yeah, so if I can just kick this off, because it's been so exciting for me to watch the uptake in all of our climate smart ag programs. They are all oversubscribed. We have more funding available this year than we've ever had for the Healthy Soils program, and we're still in the grant application process for that. But the concepts are not entirely new. We've been able to build off of the history of the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which does do the verification and measurement to make sure that we're funding programs that we know work. And what we are seeing, because of our variations in soils in this state, different microclimates, people do have some skepticism about certain practices, but not all of the practices. So what we're excited about is being able to work with you at the Natural Resources Agency and the Air Resources Board to do additional modeling. And the one other thing I want to add for optimism here is that the United States Department of Agriculture earlier this month announced the release of almost $1 billion that will be available, where they want us on a regional basis to put forward proposals about measuring and verifying and bring this confidence that the senator talked about, so that we have some way of doing something that will restore confidence in our ability to do this kind of work on our lands, to actually be a part of the climate solution. So we're putting in a really big grant proposal for that.
That's great. But all the while, we're spending that money that the legislature is appropriating, right, to get good projects on the ground.
That's right.
Nicole, how about you? The rice industry, as you said, you've got a really symbiotic crop for wildlife, because your cover crop is winter water, which is the wildlife needs as a result of us, having paved the wetlands over 170 years. How about other other crops within agriculture? I mean, do you think people are starting to, in agriculture, are starting to take interest in this idea of capturing carbon or carbon farming? What's your take?
Mute, Nicole, mute.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, farmers around the US are very interested in carbon sequestration and carbon health. And every soil type is different. And so it's done differently depending on what region you're in. And I agree with Secretary Ross, the NRCS programs have been instrumental to help include those throughout the United States. And, and as I said, it's not a one size fits all project. What we might do on the Van Vleck Ranch for soil health on a cattle ranch is very different than on a rice field at Montana Farms. And it's what comes with biodiversity, right? As you mentioned, Secretary, is that biodiversity in terms of our species and what they need in terms of the conservation that we can provide and the habitat that we can provide on a rice field does come with some modest methane emissions, but that has to be weighed with the fact that we have soil health by generating about 3.5 tons of rice straw that we put back into our soil to help our soil health in that regard. So it's the measurements that we can continue to get from NRCS and our other partners about what research and what practices are working well continues to evolve, and we need to invest in that type of research going forward, because it benefits all the growers, and the growers are really thirsty for the information and they want to know what's out there.
That's really helpful. And Karen, I think you may have introduced me to the California Rangeland Trust.
Yes.
That's a great organization that is helping those cattle ranchers that are interested in developing these conservation easements that have multiple benefits, right? Including sequestration. So just so much good work happening.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question for Frankie, and Daniel, who's one of the participants here today, is asking us a question about state support for building capacity for tribal communities, particularly smaller ones, to actually build capacity to engage. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I wanted to ask you, we have probably a lot of people that are listening in on this and that are really moved by the way that you talk about stewardship and the centering of people and that stewardship. But a lot of folks I talk to don't have engagement with tribes that have called, lands that people steward, their ancestral homelands. So can you just let us know around how would folks that want to learn from, tribes relevant to the area that they're at and engage with tribes in a respectful way?
I think that's a fantastic question. And really, there's tribes throughout the entire state. We have 150 tribes, 160 tribes, and I think it's as easy as much as Googling where you're at in looking for the tribe. We work with tons of tribes all over the state and work in partnerships. I know that the state has a pretty sour history with tribes, but I think there's a huge openness for tribal leaderships to really work with partners. Several of our partners are on the call today. I was looking at the panel. I was like, hey, we work with some of these folks, but I think it really is that simple. I think there's a bit of a thought that it's tribes are difficult to get a hold of or reach. We're really not. We really are all over the place. We're pretty accessible. We're pretty easy to find. And I think just reaching out, taking that initial step, I think that's really the biggest hurdle we found, is having our partners and our folks, our neighbors, people who live with our ancestral territory, take that first step in simply reaching out to the tribes. And I would encourage anyone, if they're thinking about the land they're on and how they could work to find climate solutions, reach out to the tribes around you, and you will find willing partners who are more than willing to share their knowledge for the land that I'm sure they already know about and already have stories about, and have all kinds of knowledge that we'd love to share. We really do think that building partnerships and working with all those within our ancestral territory is how we're going to bring balance back to our world.
Wade, do you mind if I ask a question of Manny and Julie in particular? Because this whole idea of measuring, monitoring, measuring, and verifying is going to be critical to really creating even more robust public and private sector partnerships to move these advances forward. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on easy, ready to use, not overly complicated ways to do that on working lands where the individual farmer or tribal member wants to get like real-time feedback. Do you have some great thoughts on those particular sets of helping to move this forward?
Sure, I'm happy to start. The really fun map that I showed, and the data that derived from was from a rangeland monitoring network. It's a network of ranchers who provide that information to us, and we work with them to just show them how they do this, collect that data. And the idea here is, how do we create a community of people who are enabled and empowered to do this kind of measurements, and then provide it not only so that we can develop science, but so that they can learn from each other. So, and one of the things that we've been working with right now, you mentioned USDA and NRCS and their leading role in this. we're working right now with USDA to develop protocols. How do you create easier ways of measuring for different applications of soil, different practices on soil, which we're excited about. It's a 3-year work that we're doing. Science takes a little while, but we're excited about as it develops to then share it through CDFA and other mechanisms to the people, to the community.
Yeah, I'll also add, I posted in the chat just now, but we've been working a bit on this topic for the last couple of years, folks, to get at how do you measure if those willows and cottonwoods that you've restored, for the value of wildlife or for the farm edges or for pollinators or for water conservation, what's their carbon value? And so this dashboard actually helps us in the voluntary market articulate how much carbon are you accumulating when you grow a willow next to a stream. And what River Partners is working on right now is if you can put those a lot of landowners together in a programmatic way, you can minimize those verification costs and optimize how much of that credit sale can go to long-term management of those natural areas.
Perfect. Thanks, Wade.
Yeah, indeed, Karen. And I would just add, there are a lot of very specific questions coming through the Q&A about measuring carbon, whether it's in deserts or on farms and impacted by geology. So one clear takeaway is building this network of practitioners is really, really helpful. And how we can, use it at a big governmental level, but also at the resource management, the, plot level as well.
Yeah.
I want to bring my colleague Amanda Hansen into the discussion. One of my former colleagues, Alex Loomer, asks in the Q&A, what portion of our carbon neutrality target can we really hope to ascribe to natural and working lands? And of course, that's the $1 million question. And then somebody else, I think it was Sophia or Anne, asks about just how are there resources for capacity building if there are groups on the ground that want to work on these projects. So in a long sort of backing up a bit, so to answer those questions, can you talk about, there's this new strategy that we've developed to help answer these questions, and it's actually connected into the state's scoping plan, which is sort of our roadmap to achieve carbon neutrality. So for everybody in the discussion today, can you just unpack this a little bit for us?
Sure. Thanks, Wade. I'd be happy to. So as Wade just mentioned, and Manny also flagged at the top of this conversation, California has just engaged in a process of building out a strategy for the land sector to help us achieve our climate goals. And this is akin to similar strategies that we've laid out for the transportation sector, for short-lived climate pollutants, for other sort of important sectors that will help us achieve our climate goals. And really this strategy, it's the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy. And it's fundamentally intended to do sort of 3 things. First is it's intended to help people understand how lands contribute to climate goals in California. How is it that lands support carbon neutrality? Exactly what does that mean? Same thing for how is it that lands help build our climate resilience in the face of climate impacts that are here now and projected to continue coming. So really just sort of a 101 on the nexus between lands and climate action. 2, it's really intended to bring together the work that California and state agencies across our administration have been doing for many years now, along with the work that is underway by land managers across California, which is, let's take our understanding of all the opportunity in each of these landscapes, whether it's in agriculture or along our coasts with wetlands, or sparsely vegetated landscapes such as deserts, et cetera. Let's take what we know and let's really be clear about what can we do on these landscapes that will support our climate change goals in California, along with hopefully achieving other additional benefits such as increasing equity or creating economic opportunity, improving public health, the list goes on. And then third, by bringing all of these pieces together, we're really attempting to sort of guide and accelerate climate smart land management in California. So really hoping that, people will utilize this as a tool to think about, opportunities that they have available to them, whether it's in land that they manage at home or through work, how can they contribute to achieving California's climate goals on our lands in California? And just to get to their question about, what percentage of our lands can deliver on carbon neutrality, that is, as Wade says, the $1 million question. CARB is in the process of developing or pulling together our 2022 scoping plan, which will, in addition to setting out sort of how is it that we're going to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are called for in legislation, it will also lay out how will we achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 or earlier. And for the first time, CARB is doing modeling to understand the role of natural and working lands as sort of a sink and or a source in the future. So hopefully we'll be learning more about that nexus soon. But I think one thing is clear, regardless of whether lands are going to be a source in the near term or a sink in the near term, we know that our investments in climate smart land management will help us achieve our climate goals, whether it's to sort of increase their ability to be a sink or to reduce their the amount that they are a source. So I'll stop there and thanks.
Hey, quick follow-up question on resources. So if there are those joining here today that want funding or want to build capacity to be able to work on this, do we have funding in nature-based solutions or natural and working lands? Are you and others, sort of key staff, thinking about capacity building as actually a priority, honestly?
Yeah, so the 21-22 budget, which was last year's budget, had more general fund dollars in nature-based climate solutions than any budget in California state history. So there is a lot of funding opportunities available to people. And I would just note that one of those funding opportunities is a set aside, which was intended to help the administration and legislature think through how is it that we want to invest in implementation of this climate smart land strategy, as well as implementation of our 30 by 30 pathways document, which is the strategy to achieve our goal of conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. So we have this set aside that is intended to help us implement both of those strategies. And I would just say that, we've been listening to public input sort of in the development of the drafts, which have been released, as well as through the public feedback that we've gotten on those drafts. And technical assistance and capacity building is a consistent thread. And I see Karen nodding, and so I'll turn it over to her if she wants to add anything into here. But to say that we're taking it seriously is an understatement. We're very focused in this space, so excited to talk more soon.
Yeah, I just want to add, I call it the secret sauce, is incentive dollars, voluntary practices, demonstration projects, and technical assistance, capacity building, including dedicated resources for our underserved farmers that are historically left out of these kinds of programs, to do targeted outreach and support for helping them apply for these incentive dollars. So we can't do it without that kind of an investment.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to respond to a question that my friend Laura asks, and just really trying to understand the connectivity to equity and the work around addressing inequity in our state. Frankie talked a lot about the holistic approach to stewardship. And I think too often in the state, or in just big organizations in general, we get very siloed, right? You're either working on water or forests. And as you guys have pointed out, Julie and Frankie, those two are connected. You're either working on nature or you're working on equity. And of course, that's a trap. And we're not going to get to where we need to go if that's the approach. So we are working to integrate our priorities. So we want nature-based solutions that redress inequity and build equitable access, for example. And Julie, I remember I had a chance to visit one of the projects that you guys organized down on the confluence of the Tuolumne and the San Joaquin, I think. And you actually had youth working through the local conservation corps out there, actually making good money and getting really important work benefits. So maybe, Julie, just talk a little bit about, you're on the ground doing this conservation projects. You're probably termed an environmental group or a conservation group. how do you actually operationalize this equity priority?
Yeah, we were actually founded by farmers. And when you look at a restoration project we're doing, it often looks like farming. That was done by design because of the intention of, our founders here at River Partners to be inclusive of communities that have been disenfranchised or have been disconnected from decision making for a long time. They tend to be on the margins of kind of rural and agricultural areas across the Central Valley. And inclusion means getting a job and getting paid to participate in improving ecological health, both in your local community and in areas up and down the region where you live. So I was really excited. On Friday, we were actually out near that same project, Wade, planting trees around the community of Grayson. We had over 50 folks out planting native trees and shrubs. And we're recruiting through workforce development programs in partnership with the Great Valley Conservation Corps to get folks from that community trained up, working in ecological restoration. And we actually have a pipeline of restoration leaders, is what we call them, bringing folks through workforce development programs and eventually into permanent jobs in the ecosystem restoration sector, which we feel is growing rapidly. So that experience, that on the ground learning is part of what comes of just participating in projects as they get developed. So it's been a really rewarding experience for all of us here at River Partners.
Thanks. Manny, it looks like you were working to get in and answer that question too, around the intersection between so-called conservation and equity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we've, as you said, we thought about it as separate kind of issues, and they're not. They really are. The only way we achieve the scale that we need to achieve is by empowering every one of our community members to be part of this and to see the benefits from this. And one of the things that when I think about science, as we create science, there's research, there's applied science, but a really important piece for us is education, really bringing the next scientists up. And we've been really focused on diversifying sort of not only the K through 12 kids who are learning about science, who are saying, wait a minute, maybe this is something that I can get into, but also apprenticeships, just building the next pipeline of more diverse voices, more diverse scientists. And I think that's the way we start asking different questions and really get innovative and disruptive kind of thinking.
Absolutely. Karen, in a moment, I'm going to turn to you just to begin to conclude our discussion here, because an hour and 15 minutes passes fast when you're talking about this subject with these people. But I really appreciate a question Jessica asked, and she's interested in whether what we're talking about include efforts to incentivize carbon storage on private lands, not necessarily big ag lands, but urban landscapes, yards and gardens, promoting climate-wise landscaping. Manny's talked about really trying to recruit everyone to be a solution provider here. So I don't know, that's a tough question, but Amanda, is that something we're actually thinking about around how to get everybody involved?
Absolutely. I would actually note that, Manny showed the various landscapes that we are we've rolled up all of California's landscapes into 8 landscapes, which is, I think, very difficult for people who have a focus on a particular landscape. But I want you to know that it is an attempt to be consistent with sort of broader scientific principles here. But the number of priority nature-based climate solutions for developed lands, which is essentially where we live, our communities, our yards, our open space, our parks, there are more climate smart land management priorities in that section than any other landscape in California. And that's really, the result of our engagement with so many people across the state who are really excited about contributing to this space.
Yeah, thank you. And I just note that our colleague Mark put in the chat for everybody to see a link to that strategy. So you'll there, and that's still in draft form, going to be finalized this spring. You'll see what we're prioritizing in that area in sort of built communities. So there's so many great questions, Karen. I wish I could just filibuster through and ask all these questions, but maybe bring us to, we've got about 5 minutes left, share some sort of concluding thoughts, and then maybe give everybody a chance for any final thoughts they have.
Sure. And so thanks for this great conversation. I just want to go home and do the work. This was so great. So thank you to Manny and to Frankie and to Julie and to Nicole and to you, Amanda, for continuing to shepherd us through this big big document. It's so exciting to have the state of California leading with these types of opportunities that include everybody in California. I think what we've heard here is about a very integrated, holistic approach that's built on partnerships. We won't succeed without those partnerships. I hope that everyone who listened does have a better sense of what do we mean by natural working lands that include every corner of California, with opportunities for every Californian to be a part of the solution. That's what's most exciting for me. And I do have to say, it was so wonderful to have a representative from the legislature with us, because they have helped really, put a lot of this into statute, but they've also ensured that there's significant investments. So Governor Newsom has led the way with some of his proposals. The legislature's made it possible for us to be this living laboratory to prove out what is really possible on our natural working lands. So kudos to everyone who is with us today. Wonderful program. You did a great job. Let's get some more work done.
Thank you, Karen. All right, let's have a last challenging. This is called the speed round. Julie invoked big, bold ideas. So I want to ask everybody, you have an opportunity to suggest one thing to either state government leaders or to people listening here. It can be something super specific, or it can be a concept that you want to reinforce. Julie.
I'll go in and I'll say state and federal partnership to yield some really tremendous ecological resilience for California on the order of magnitude of some of the other state and federal investments we've had over the last couple of generations.
So we need to step up with our federal partners and really invest at a greater scale, focus more together, and really for larger impact.
Yep.
Got it. Nicole.
Lean on your farmers and ranchers in California to help get this work done.
Incredible. Manny or Frankie? Manny.
Sure. I think we have the federal government investing. We have the amazing investments of California. Let's bring those two streams together and get them better aligned and really invest in the research that we need to do.
Excellent. Frankie, quite appropriate. The vice chairman gets the last word here.
I feel like I should say give land back to the tribes, but I'll say creating an implementation strategy to bring good fire back to all of California.
Yeah, and get land back to the tribes.
And get land back to the tribes. There you go.
All right. Well, Secretary Ross, panelists, thanks so much. Really energizing discussion. Huge thanks to everybody that joined today for the work that you're doing. We who work in state government know we're only one small part of this, and really it's the work that happens across the state that's going to get us where we need to go on climate change and our lands and waters and our solutions, our nature-based solutions. So thanks once again, and have a wonderful day and have a great rest of your short week.